Catholic writer is Caryll Houselander, and with me is Sister Mary Leonora Wilson, who's going to explain to us and to me some of her enthusiasm for this British writer. So,
very good. Okay, yes, you're right. I am very enthused about Caryll Houselander. I became familiar with her, probably 40 or more years ago, when a spiritual director suggested that I read her book, Read of God, and it fascinated me from the beginning. The way she shows Mary as an instrument in God's plan of salvation, but she also brings out so much of the humanness in the daily life of a mother in Mary's own existence, and I just found it refreshing. It wasn't theological, it was really practical spirituality that everyone could relate to. And then later, because I started using that book almost every Advent, I thought, let me read some more of her writings. And so the next thing I read was her autobiographical writing, A Rocking Horse Catholic. And for some reason, I just wasn't ready for it.
That was my introduction to Caryll Houselander, and I was intrigued by it.
Yeah, I don't know why, because when I read it then years later, I was enthralled with it. But at that moment, it just turned me off for some reason. And I probably couldn't relate to it very much because it was very
She's an extraordinary character, too.
Yeah. But then later, like 10 years later, reading it again, I said, I wonder why I had such a problem with this. This is beautiful. So, I mean, even in our spiritual reading at times, we just need to let things sit and wait for the right moment because things strike us differently at different times. But Caryll Houselander has really pretty much accompanied me in a great part of my spiritual journey. Her Stations of the Cross I've used over and over again. Yeah, they are.
And she did the illustrations because she wasn't a writer.
She was an artist.
And she tried to make a living as an artist. She typified the struggling artist stereotype, really.
Really, yeah. And it was in explaining her woodcuts that Frank Sheed discovered that she could write. And suggested that she do some essays. She was also, besides being a struggling artist, as you said, and she ended up being a prolific writer. She was also very socially engaged during World War II. She lived through 2 world wars, as a child World War I, and then as a young adult World War II. And in World War II, she was very active in the war effort, but also very socially engaged among the poor, and especially among those struggling psychologically, among children coming from war-torn families and trauma and difficult situations. She started to work as a therapist with them, not because she was trained in therapy, but because she was a natural. And it was the doctor himself, I think his name was Dr. Strauss, who reached out to her. She was also a great friend of Knox.
That's right,
yeah,
Ronald Knox.
Ronald Knox. And he was a great admirer of her writing. So, she moved in circles that,
they astound us today.
Yeah,
when we think about it. She was great friends with Maisie Ward.
That's right.
So Sheed and Ward became her publishers.
Yeah, and Maisie became her biographer.
That's good, and that's maybe not so good.
Not so good. For example, they collected all the letters of Caryll Houselander, which are I love them, but when I read anybody who critiques them, who's knowledgeable, literary critics, they tear them to pieces because Maisie Ward took out all the parts that she thought would not do justice to Caryll Houselander or might put her in a negative light. So they're incomplete and they're inadequate. But I heard that you can get all of the letters from the University of Notre Dame, that they have them in their archives.
I would be very interested in that.
Me too.
And I've been doing some research on Caryll Houselander myself, and now people are starting to do doctoral level studies on Caryll Houselander. That's That's the level of writer she is. That
right.
doctoral studies are starting to come out on her writings.
Her spirituality seems to have been very much influenced also by Julian of Norwich. In fact, if you
Makes
read,
sense.
if you read the Reed of God, where she speaks of the rhythms, that's Julian of Norwich. That's very Julian of Norwich. So she's that kind of a mystic, I think. I need to read more of Julian of Norwich to be able to.
Julian writes about being one with Christ, and Caryll writes about being Christed.
Christed, yeah.
Because that's kind of her,
also
great theme.
Yes, very much so. And one of her great moments, spiritual moments, was when Jesus revealed to her that he is present in every human individual. And that happened on the tube. It didn't happen in prayer or in contemplation. It happened when she was traveling in the tube, which would be the equivalent of one of our subway. And she was tired. She was actually, if I remember her telling about the story of that day, she was actually tired. She was angry. She was frustrated. She was holding on. She didn't have a place to sit. And then all of a sudden, in that situation and in that state of soul, she was looking at the people around her on the subway and kept seeing the face of the crucified Christ in them, but actually his face in their clothing and everything. And it was so powerful that it colored everything that from that point on in her life. She always remembered that vision. So being Christed, but also seeing Christ in everyone else. The two were really intimately connected in her spirituality. And I think that's also what makes her so important for us today, because we tend to put people in categories and judge by all sorts of things, but we forget that every single human person is made in the image and likeness of God, and that image and likeness is Jesus Christ, because he is the Son.
The image of the invisible God.
Yeah, right. So I think that's important. She also has a bit of the Russian spirituality in her, and she did at a difficult time in her life when she was when she left the church because of so many injustices that she had lived.
And downright just scandalous pettiness too.
Yes.
But disedifying stupidity.
Very disedifying. And you figure she was a young woman in her 20s at that time. Yeah. So, plus she didn't really have yet a lot of foundation to stand on.
She wasn't catechized.
No, she was not catechized. She was baptized when she was 9 years old because her mother decided at that point that the whole family was going to become Catholic. They, for some strange reason, maybe it was the war situation. I don't know why, but they were all baptized without any form of catechesis. Right. Yeah. So she did go to a couple Catholic boarding schools, but even those were a little strange from what I could tell from her own writings. Mm-hmm. So she didn't have a lot to stand on. And she left the church. She was searching. She was always searching. From the beginning of her life practically till the end, she was genuinely searching for God. And that's why I think God continued to reach out to her. And she was able to recognize him. But at one point of that search, she went to the Russian Orthodox Church and really threw herself into that. And I think came away with some of the more beautiful aspects of their spirituality. I say that because I lived 8 years in Russia, so I too have been very much influenced by the beauty of the Russian Orthodox spirituality, their long-suffering, their ability to see in suffering the God who suffers with humanity. That she really came away with. And also this sense of mystery. A great sense of mystery and appreciation for mystery, not needing to dissect and understand everything. Mm-hmm. And part of the Russian spirituality is this idea of being a fool for Christ. And I almost said Dorothy because she's very similar to Dorothy
She
Day
is.
in many
So
ways,
they
isn't
have
she?
a lot.
Yeah, they really do.
She's like a British Dorothy
Yeah,
Day.
right. But
They're
Caryll,
almost the same age too.
yeah, right, and in the same
Yeah.
time periods and all. The Caryll used to dress funny and then put white paste on her face, kind of like kind of makeup, but make her face all white and blotchy, and then go out on the streets to make people laugh at her. And in one of her writings, she said, "It's a great act of charity to make people laugh." So she wasn't doing it because she was, well, she was eccentric, but she wasn't she wasn't doing it just out of eccentricity. She was really doing it to make people laugh in a time where people didn't have much to laugh about.
Right.
Yeah. So, and even that with the children, as I said, she worked with underprivileged children. She was always trying to get them to laugh, to come out of the tragedies that they were living. Not negating those tragedies, but showing them that there was something more to live for and that life could be beautiful, even though she herself had lived one hardship after another and some tragedies too. I'm always impressed by the way she threw herself into helping people during the war at a time of terror and fear and anxiety and bombings.
daily bombardments from the Nazis.
Yeah. And still, she was always thinking of the other person. One day, while she was at the end of the day, the Blitz alarms went off, and she was to go back. She was just getting ready to go home, and she thought, "Oh, maybe I'll make it before the bombardment starts."
Great.
So she runs out into the street, going toward where she wanted to go, and the bombardment started. So she said, "I have to throw myself to the ground." And she thought, while she was throwing herself to the ground, these are some of the amazing things, and it's where you discover the spirituality of this woman. As she was throwing herself to the ground, she said to herself, "God, this is the way we need to be before you, with our faces to the ground."
Wow.
She was able to forget the fear for her own life.
Right. And she was petrified.
She was. She was a person who was by nature petrified of everything. Extremely so. But that's what she was thinking when she threw herself to the ground. And then the other thing she was thinking was, "Well, I hope I don't break the Christmas presents I'm carrying." Those two things. It's such a contrast, but again, isn't it like us? I mean, sometimes you're walking to communion with the most, Jesus, I'm going to receive you, the most sublime moment, and then something very ordinary comes into mind. And that's who we are.
Don't let me forget this errand that I have to.
Yeah. That's how we are, and God knows that. But here she was thinking, this is the attitude that we need to have before you. She blacked out, and then when the rescue workers came, they thought they were going to find her dead. She was covered with broken glass, and broken glass all around her because all the shop windows had blown out. And they lifted her up, and she said she didn't have a scratch. Wow. Just amazing. So even there, God showed his care for her. And she was always able to recognize that. Yeah. She was extremely available to others to the point of overdoing it.
She needed people to rescue her from herself, from her availability.
In fact, she never locked her apartment door so that anybody who wanted to wait for her to come home could just go into her apartment and wait. And she said sometimes at the end of a full day, because she was working either in the war effort or helping under the children or whatever, and because she wrote mostly at night, she'd come home at the end of the evening of a full day, open her apartment door, and sometimes see as many as 6 or 7 people waiting to speak to her, each one individually, naturally. And at that moment, she said the breath would just go out of her. And for 10 minutes, she wouldn't be able to do anything. She would just kind of stare. But while she was staring, she said it was like God was, filling her with strength. And she said when when that initial anxiety was over and she came out of it again, she was able to take time with each of those. And after they went home, she would write.
Yeah, and throughout the war, she was writing the book that became This War is the Passion.
Yeah, which was recently reprinted. So, and I think her writings, because they do deal with so much anxiety that people face in times of uncertainty and of war and of violence, they are very much appropriate for what society is going through today.
Because she really dealt with reality, with real feelings. She didn't sublimate things.
Not at all. She was so genuine. I think that's one of the reasons I love her. And she was not a person of fine words. I mean, she said things. She had a sharp tongue. She was noted for a sharp tongue, for drinking, and for smoking. So it doesn't really sound like the description of a mystic, and yet she was profoundly mystical. And to me, that is so beautiful, because it shows that God can make saints out of us as we are. He doesn't wait for us to fit some description of perfection that we have. Right. This is our projection of perfection, not his. His is that we remain open to him and keep seeking him and keep responding to his will, and he will do the rest regardless of how we are. And she proves that. She really proves that. She's totally genuine all the time, and she hated people who weren't genuine.
Now, we have a lot of her essays. We've got the Stations of the Cross with her woodcuts that the illustrations that she did. The stations are incredible.
Yeah.
We have The Reed of God, which has never gone out of print.
Right.
Did she do any fiction?
She did one fiction. It was called Dry Wood, This Dry Wood, or something like that. It's rather a dark novel, but again, it's unfortunately it's not in print. And there are a couple of her things that are available as a PDF online. I'm not sure if the Dry Wood is one of them. Okay. But anyway, in the Dry Wood, each chapter focuses on a different person from a different walk of life. They're fictional, but I'm sure they're drawn from her
vast.
Yes. And each one is enmeshed in some kind of sin. So it's a novel about redemption. Okay. In the lives of all these persons. So there's, for example, there's Carmel Fernandez is a lost child fallen from grace who hides away in the house. This is interesting. There's a lot of autobiographical information in here too. She used to, as a child, she would hide away, hoping that nobody would find her, hide in the closet, hide in the corner whenever people came over. And then God in her adult life thrusts her out into the lives of other individuals. Then there's Rose O'Shane, who wears fine clothes and walks a show of greatness of the grand past, and she's really vain. Each one of these persons in this story personifies one of the 7 capital sins. Yeah, it's pretty obvious. It's probably not the way we would write a novel. Yeah. Okay. So, but yes, that was her one novel. I don't know how well it did, but I do know that she and Ward did really great with her books. I mean, she was their top author for a long time, and they printed thousands and thousands.
And they were a very, very top publisher.
Yeah, and very stringent too. I mean, they didn't print, just anything.
Right.
So they were. So that was her one book, her one novel. She also did a book of poetry, which was called The Flowering Tree. Now you'll find poetry in most of her stuff. She does add poems here and there, even in The Reed of God, or in some of her other books too. But she did one book of complete poetry called The Flowering Tree. I like her poetry. It's it's not as deep or as profound as the poetry, for example, of Gertrude von Lefort or something, but it's very spiritual, and it really, again, draws you into prayer. So that's yeah. So those are the two things that are not essays. She did the Mother of Christ, which the Our Lady, you could see, had a profound influence on her life. She writes a lot about the Blessed Mother and the suffering of Christ. Yeah, those are the two things. Probably another reason I'm particularly fond of her, because I'm very much drawn to both of those, the Passion of Jesus Christ and to Our Lady. So, and she was a spiritual director for many people, and really helped them. Her main thrust was to have them rely on the loving providence of God. In fact, she would tell people, this is interesting, it's in one of her letters, as they were preparing for confession, don't take more than 2 minutes to prepare yourself for confession, and only confess what you can remember in those 2 minutes. Because the reason for confession is not to dwell on yourself and your sins, but to receive the loving forgiveness of our Lord Jesus Christ. Really, I mean, her emphasis was always Jesus, to be looking at Jesus. In fact, she wrote to somebody else that she thought the best way to grow spiritually was to always be looking at Jesus Christ. And she said, it will help you stop thinking about yourself.
Oh.
I mean, super practical. You don't need to be a theologian to...
Yeah.
So her spirituality is really great for anyone of all, I would say, of all times. And it proves that you don't need to be a nun in a cloister
or a theologian
or a pope or have some great preparation and piety even from childhood on, because she did not. But you do need to keep seeking Christ, looking for him. And he was definitely the teacher, the mentor, the guide in her life. So,
and that's what makes Caryll Houselander a Catholic writer every Catholic should read.
Exactly.